You're listening to episode 123 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ramsey Margolis speaks with us today about building secular Buddhism community in New Zealand. We've seen a surge recently in the creation and development of secular Buddhism sites across the world, serving our diverse public of contemporary practitioners with a wonderful variety of online resources. There are many approaches to secular practice, from having an interest in more naturalistic interpretations of early Buddhist texts, to seeing how science is contributing to our understanding of how our minds work. They're all correct, and not mutually exclusive, which allows secular Buddhism to represent a very large and diverse bunch of people with common, and often complementary, ways of being secular. What we're seeing now is a transition from the historically slow spread of Buddhism through physical, geographic dispersal to more immediate availability and consumption of ideas through the virtual and geographic independent tools of social networking. Online groups are easy to set up, maintain, and join. More interestingly, though, is that we're seeing these tools bring it back home as they foster the development of face-to-face practice. Ramsey Margolis is Executive Director of the New Zealand Cooperatives Association. He started a sitting group in 1999, which developed into Wellington Insight Meditation Community, and put out a newsletter for the group. A secular Buddhist practitioner since the late 1990s, he claims two passions in life, apart from his lovely wife: good food and the printed word. Ramsey's intention is to help create a culture of generosity. So, sit back, relax, and have a New Zealand's own Kawa Kawa tea. And yes, I do have a link to it on the episode page. Our guest today is Ramsey Margolis. Ramsey, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for interviewing me. It's a pleasure.
Very glad to. And in fact, I wanted to thank you. So I'm very appreciative of not just your time here today, but you are one of the early listeners of the podcast. And you were one of the first people who emailed me about it and introduced me to our friend Winton Higgins. And so thank you very much for that. That's been extremely helpful, and it's been great to have you along for the whole ride.
Yep, good. I'm enjoying the ride. But it goes up and down from time to time, but that's fun.
It does. It's been a good ride so far.
Bucking Bronco, yeah.
So what I'd like to have you do to start us, Ramsey, is tell us a bit about your background, how you came to have a secular Buddhist kind of practice.
Well, I think I started off as a secular. Secularity was my first interest, and when I first approached Buddhism, it was with a great degree of suspicion, caution, fear, all those kinds of things. I was raised in North London in a very much a secular Jewish family. I had my bar mitzvah at the age 13, then more or less forgot about being a religion from then onwards. and got involved in radical politics, as one did in 1968 and that kind of era. Um, then I guess when was it? In the late 80s, early 90s, I bought a book on meditation in London. Funny enough, it was a New Zealand book. At that time, I wasn't living in New Zealand, but I bought it, and it was reasonably practical and even secular in a funny way. But I just found it a little bit too new agey, so I never got into it in a serious manner. And a few years later, I bought a book on Buddhism called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, the Sogyal Rinpoche book. And I found myself enjoying a lot of it, but arguing with the author all the way through, that kind of thing. I mean, it just didn't suit me. So some of it was touching my heart, and other bits just didn't. I thought, oh, this is nonsense. And I kind of kept it on the bookshelf, but didn't do very much about it. But I guess within me, there was always this urge to look inwards rather than outwards. My socialist practice, if you like, my activities were outward looking, but not inward looking. And I felt there was some kind of need. So in the mid-90s, I dropped into a few meditation sessions run by the Western Buddhist Order in London, in Cornwall, where I lived for a wee while, and in San Francisco. I mean, I like the name, Western Buddhist Order. They were too religious for my taste, and I kind of distrusted them. I mean, let's face it, a tiny group in San Francisco, which calls their little terrace house the San Francisco Buddhist Center, were pretending to be something they weren't, and that was just more than a bit sus to me. So that was my kind of introduction to it. I left England in 1993, and I went traveling for 4 years. Went all over the world, and I stopped in 1997 in Auckland, New Zealand. I got a job. I got permit to stay here, which is what I'm very pleased about. And I did an introduction to meditation, a program at the Auckland Buddhist Center. As you see, that's a tiny little place run by the Western Buddhist Order. I thought I might as well learn to do it properly. It was very basic, and I have to say very, very good. One thing I remember is that when we went around the room at the beginning, there were about 30 of us. People were asked to state what brought us here. And I said that I was looking to be more relaxed, more calm, and more at ease. And out of the 30, one person said they were looking at insight. And I remember thinking, what on earth is she talking about?
What's this insight thing of what you said?
Yeah, what's that about? So anyway, I was there to become more calm and more at ease. And this was about the time when the London Guardian newspaper had written an article about the founder of this group, and all kind of revelations were coming out the woodwork. So really, I think I would say that unconsciously what I was looking for was a secular approach to meditation. And I went, I was still looking. I'd moved away. I left Auckland, and I'd left the Western Buddhist Order well behind, wanting nothing really to do with them. And I went to an insight meditation retreat, and it felt very good. It was very good. It was good enough for me to come back to Wellington and say to the guys who'd been on the retreat with me, we should meet weekly. We should do something about this. It's been a great retreat. Let's see what we can carry on doing. That's how this group called Wellington Insight Meditation Community started. It's been going now since 1999, 2000. I can't remember the year that was. I was aware of the MBSR movement, but that never really attracted me. I felt it wasn't that they'd thrown out the baby with the bathwater. The people here were very much doctors and medical people, so there was really no room for me because I'm not a doctor.
Right. It was in that therapeutic context is where we
exactly
typically have that, and I know they want to grow past that. I'm reading one of their textbooks now, and they're very clear about that. They want to see this grow outside of the context it initially came from with John Kabat-Zinn and all of that. But that's where it is right now. So that's one of the hurdles that they've got.
Yeah. So I mean, that, if you like, was the most secular thing going. But I felt that insight meditation communities that I was seeing, and the podcast, were they podcasts? The Dharma talks and the audio Dharma talks I was downloading the insight meditation community in America was the most secular thing I could relate to. Some particular teachers I really loved, like, for example, for a couple of years, I've been listening to every talk by Gil Fronsdal from Palo Alto. And then at one point, I got on to Tara Brach in Washington and really, really, really enjoyed it. And another guy I really loved was a teacher called Eric Kolvik, who kept himself completely under the out of the radar. It took me 2 years to get in touch with him and invite him to New Zealand. And it took him another few more years before he accepted. I had to go to New Mexico to attend a retreat with him to say, okay, now I'm here. Will you come to New Zealand? And he agreed to. He's a lovely man and a wonderful teacher and has a great sense of political justice, which I think, fits very well with me and my social justice sort of output. So that was kind of my road to, I had a secular approach all along. The Wellington Insight Meditation Community, I think I can probably count on one hand the number of the times we had a Rupa in the room. It was just, we come, we sit, we meditate, and we talk, listen to Dharma talks, and that was it. It was a very unreligious atmosphere, which some people liked and some people didn't. Other insight meditation communities around the country are quite different. So, I realized that I was sort of hanging out for something slightly different. Stephen Batchelor I discovered during these years, particularly Buddhism without beliefs. And I realized that was the kind of teachings that I was relating to and I felt very comfortable with. And Stephen Batchelor's been to New Zealand a few times at my invitation. The last time he was here, which was earlier this year, I was unable to organize his retreat, so someone else took that on. I had too much work to do. This particular year is a rather difficult, busy year for me for work. So yeah, this was my kind of journey.
Now that's led to quite a few things. You mentioned the Wellington Insight, and the first online presence that I was aware of that really registered with me is the YouTube channel that you have. And folks who are listening to the podcast, I'll link to all of these things we're talking about on the episode page, so you'll see that. Was that the first online offering, or did that grow out of something else?
It actually grew out of the Wellington Insight Meditation Community. If you look at it, it's youtube.com/Wellington Insight, but I don't have anything to do with that group at the moment or we couldn't change the name of the channel. So once you look at it, once you get there, it's Secular Buddhism New Zealand. The first online, I'm not sure what came first now. I think the first thing that came up was insightmeditation.org.nz, which is still going, which was an attempt to try and create an online community or a place where it was a wiki. It's a wiki where the local groups could go and they could promote what they were doing and advertise themselves and attract people to them, but it never really took off because no one was interested in doing this. I could never work out why. I still can't work out why.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of them take off very well and others not so much. But yeah. I see that the site itself, the new one, and that's for folks listening, secularbuddhism.org.nz or NZ if you prefer, that's the new site. And you're going to have to help me pronounce one of the words here because I know I'm going to get it wrong. You have as the subtitle for the site for Secular Buddhism New Zealand, creating a secular Buddhist community in
Aotearoa.
Aotearoa. I'm never going to say that right. New Zealand. Tell us about that.
Aotearoa is the Maori word for the country, and it roughly means the land of the long white cloud. When the first canoes arrived, which I think was in about the 14th century, what they saw was a long white cloud in the distance, which told them there was land, and that's where they aimed for. That's where they had no idea what they were heading for, but they just had some idea they should be going there, so that's where they went. So, I mean, one of the things that interests me personally at the moment, has for a while, is what's different about New Zealand from England, where I come from, is the whole the indigenous people, the Maori people, the tangata whenua, as they're called, the people of the land, make a very strong difference to the English language, to the culture here, and it's a very rich difference. So there are people within Secular Buddhism New Zealand, Katarina Mataparai, for example, who has a very strong Maori connection, and she's bringing that into our secular Buddhism approach, and it is quite lovely. It's it is very lovely, and so that's the approach. I think that's one of the things we have to offer the world is the, the approach to the indigenous people here. So,
and in fact, I'll be scheduling a conversation with Katerina for another episode, so we will get a chance to hear from her as well. So thank you for mentioning that. One of the things I wanted to ask is how you would characterize the receptivity for secular practice in New Zealand. I know you yourself have always been this way. I have been, as well as are many of us who have come to a secular practice. We never were particularly religious. We didn't all come to secular Buddhism from a monastic tradition, as, say, Stephen and Martine Batchelor have, or others who identify as secular Buddhists. Some of us have always been secular. What's the tone of New Zealand for that?
Well, I would say as a country, it's a very secular country. There are there are the churches. There are lots of people who are new migrants who bring their religions in with them, and particularly there's a lot of Buddhists from China, from Cambodia, from Laos, from Burma, from Sri Lanka, all kinds of countries. So, and Japan, there's lots of Buddhists here of different flavors. But of the what I would call the European New Zealand, what we call Pakeha, perhaps, it's a very secular place. And even those who are religious are rarely religious in a hugely outgoing sense. So there's a receptivity for a secular approach to things in general. Saying that, a lot of people here are, there are people here who are Zen practitioners. There are Zen groups. It is like being in America in some ways, that you can wander through Wellington, our capital, and you can go to a Zen group. You can go to a Tibetan style group. You can go to all kinds of different groups. There's a secular group. It is a kind of spiritual supermarket in some ways, and they all find their adherents and their interests. So I think there is an openness to a secular practice. Saying that, I'm also involved with a church here called St. Andrew's on the Terrace, which their resident theologian is a man called Lloyd Gearing, also known as Professor Sir Lloyd Gearing, OM.
That's a big name.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he's 92, 93, 94. He's a wonderful man. I actually saw him on Wednesday night, and he took me for a ride from St. Andrew's on the Terrace to the local progressive synagogue, which was a little bit hairy, but that was fine. And it was and he one of his pamphlets, for example, is called "In Praise of Secular," and I think that's the approach of this church, St. Andrew's on the Terrace. They're trying to find a middle way between secularism, as generally the atheist would, the militant atheist would have us practice, and church practice. So I'm very happy to be a part of one of the trustees of the St. Andrew's Trust for the Study of Religion and Society, SATRS, SATRS.org.nz, if anybody wants to have a look, who do organise some very interesting discussions, and it's a very useful and good intellectual ferment going on at that church, and it's lovely. It's a good community as well.
It's very interesting to hear you say that, because every now and then I mention on the podcast that I participate as the Buddhist panelist in an ongoing series of interfaith panel discussions on various topics, and it's interesting to hear that there are other people who have a secular approach to Buddhism who are also participating in these kinds of discussions and do find them of value and to be enriching, that we can still be atheists and not antagonistic about it. We can be secular Buddhists and still participate in these kind of dialogues. So it's interesting to hear that that is happening elsewhere.
Very much so. I feel very welcome around the table. There are 8 of us around the table planning the events for the year, the ongoing events for the year last Wednesday. And I do feel very welcome. I mean, I'm often referred to by the minister as the non-Christophile contributor. and it's a very welcoming atmosphere. And it's vibrant. I mean, it's interesting that I'm probably one of the youngest people around the table. and I'm not young myself. So it's a very good group. So in all, I'd say that an interest in the secular Buddhism there could be lots of interest about it if people could find it and were to know about it and to think about it. So just having us there on the web with a website, with a YouTube channel, connected to other secular Buddhist groups around the world, such as the one in Australia, the one in your own, others elsewhere. It's fabulous.
Yeah, it's nice to see that we have, and I mentioned this several episodes ago, that there are openly declared secular Buddhist sites in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand, in the UK, in Germany, and it's more and more, particularly just in the past 6 months. We've seen quite a number of new sites springing up, and that's just those that are actual sites, let alone Facebook pages and groups and things like that. So one of the things, let's talk about that now.
Kate came to see me yesterday. We went up to my office and we sat in front of the computer for a while. We had a wide-ranging discussion. Kate has just set up a Facebook page, which is actually a Facebook page and a Facebook group, and we're not really sure which one to run with out of those two. For Secular Buddhism New Zealand, to try and, again, we don't know what we're trying to do. It's kind of, are we driving traffic to the website or driving people from the website to the Facebook page? We'll find all that out, which way it's going to go. It's really, we're dipping our toes in the water of this kind of thing. I guess, personally, I got the domain secularbuddhism.org.nz in 2010, and I sat on it for a couple of years. It's something I clearly wanted to do, but having set up insightmeditation.org.nz, one insight meditation community, and withdraw, I guess I'm an organizer. I think of myself as a motivator. I'm good at setting things up, keeping them running, and then I like to sit back and let others take on those kind of roles.
Yeah.
I guess, and that's what's always important to me. But I haven't always succeeded in this. I guess what it comes down to is, for me, face-to-face contact, community is what's important. I'm not so comfortable on online communities like Facebook. I mean, I have been involved in the past in, I guess, something that they call the dark web. Was it a Karacho community around typography? And I've done it, and I've been there, and I've understood it. But I really enjoy the sense of community that you get from a potluck, where you're all together, you bring some food, and you talk. When I first left one insight meditation community, I set up what I called a Kalyana Mitta group, which was early Sunday mornings, and we had between 4 and 9 people would come over the course of several years. So that's really what I want to see come out of these communities, is a number of face-to-face communities around New Zealand and the world, of course, which are secular communities, and just see how we relate to each other.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that the way it's changing, that instead of a monastery, a brick and mortar place where you have 1 or 2 teachers serving a local community, with the advantages, particularly of social networking, we're allowing people who would otherwise not be teachers to nonetheless help educate one another, and it's more peer-to-peer rather than top-down, and we're removing many of these geographical boundaries virtually that in turn is leading to physical presences popping up like yours, and that's the idea behind Secular Buddhism New Zealand, is to create that community, that in-person community.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I've never considered myself, before now, as a teacher, because I don't see myself as having the necessary wisdom. But what's happening is that we have a weekly sitting group here in Wellington, which is very much a secular group. And people are asking me questions as if I'm the teacher. and I'm watching my response to this, and what I'm feeling is kind of it's metta. It's a kind of unconditional friendliness, what I describe as a brotherly love towards these people, and I'm just watching how I respond. But I guess I have experience. What I realized many years ago, because I was very unsatisfied with the insight meditation teachers we have here in New Zealand, I felt they were shallow, they lacked depth, and as people, they were individually all very, very cold. I couldn't really relate to them as individuals. So it's when I started discovering these wonderful teachers online, and bringing those teachings to New Zealand by playing them, playing all these different teachers at our weekly sits. So again, that raises another question which people have mentioned on other websites, which is how do we train or acknowledge the next generation of teachers? Again, no answers, but that's the question we need to, we just sit with for the next few decades, really, I suppose.
Well, that's one of the challenges that we recognize very strongly with a secular approach is that so far there are two avenues to legitimizing oneself as a teacher, as I see it. The two most obvious are you come from a given lineage, and that's a traditional religious background, which not all of us are going to have. And it doesn't mean that people can't come at it from a completely different direction and still have wonderful experience and have wonderful qualities of a teacher and be a wonderful teacher, and nonetheless not hold the lineage papers from a specific tradition. The other way is what we're seeing now with, say, the MBSR groups, that they come at it from a therapy background, from that sort of context, and they have gone through training in that way. And of course we do see things like Spirit Rock and teacher training programs like that, but there's still a very close tie to lineage there, and it's a little less. It's more so on the insight, and it's non-denominational, and they're very open about that. So it's not a Zen center, and it's not a Theravadan center, but the teaching it's just one removed from that. So how we grow a body of teachers and facilitators and guides and spiritual friends, kalyanamitas, on this path from a purely secular approach that's not in a therapeutic context, that's one of the biggest problems that we need to solve in some fashion.
Well, it'll take years. I mean, it's taken years for for the Insight Meditation community to set up a teacher training program like they have. And I'm sure it's a very good program. Some very good people have come through it, clearly. And it's very deep, and I'm sure it's a very challenging and a rewarding program. It's practical as well as theoretical. So I'm sure it's very, very, very good. But when it comes down to it, the people who come out of it, if they're going to be teachers at all, they're going to be recognized by the rest of us as being worthwhile, good. And that's what's going to count. You can call yourself a teacher, and there's a guy here in New Zealand, he calls himself a revealed master, and people are flocking to it. He's a Kiwi, he's got long hair and long beard and the robes and everything, and people I know love him. I can't understand that myself. But it's people are going to recognize someone as a teacher, or they're not. But yes, I do agree we need to upskill. We need to develop ourselves, and it's going to take, as I think, a decade or more before that particular conversation could settle into anything sort of realistically wonderful.
I also want you to talk for a few minutes about two other spots online. One is the word I'm never going to pronounce correctly, Buddhist Education Trust.
Oh yeah, okay.
Tell about that for a little bit, and then the Insight newsletter.
Okay, Aotearoa Buddhist. Let's do it the other way around. Let's talk about Aotearoa, which was the newsletter. When I got back from my very first Insight Meditation retreat up in Taupo in 1999 or 2000, whatever the year was, and I said to these three colleagues who'd been up there with me, let's sit in Wellington. We were moving around from each other's house from week to week. So every Monday, I'd send out an email to the other three saying, okay, remember, guys, we're going to be meeting at my house tomorrow. and it became kind of a weekly email. Eventually, we went from 4 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 4 to 5 to 6, and it grew up from there. And that weekly email became quite substantial. I was finding interesting pieces and putting them in, and then adding stuff. And it got to a point where people say to me, "You're sending out so much material each week, we can't read it." It's open monthly. And that was for me quite a big thing, and I agreed to it. And I enjoyed it. I didn't want to do it, but believe me, I was very pleased. And in fact, I think I've got a printout of each one of those emails, and one day I'll bind them and put them in a library or something. But so that email newsletter developed from a local monthly newsletter for the Wellington community into Insight Aotearoa. As I realised it was being read all over New Zealand, in fact, in other countries too. And it got up to quite a significant circulation, several hundred, which is pretty good for New Zealand, I thought. And again, I would bring in co-editors and say, okay, let's share this role. It was getting quite a big role. And to me, producing a newsletter was a practice in itself, and I was really enjoying that. Then about 5 years ago, I got a proper job. So instead of being a freelancer, doing bits of work here, there, and everywhere, whenever I can do it, I've actually got a full-time, well, actually started off as a part-time job, developed into a full-time job. At that point, I have to say, I gave it away to someone else to operate. And it's still going, and it's still very, it's very good. It's not how I would do it, but fine, they're doing it, and they're doing a good job with it. So that's the Insight Aotearoa newsletter. The aim behind it was to try and produce some kind of unity, some kind of community within New Zealand for those people who are interested in insight meditation. And I guess what we generally found is that we had our stalwarts, but a lot of people came in and went out. And I guess they came in because they were looking for some kind of therapeutic intervention and meditation where they saw, or the secular approach to meditation, the insight approach, something that would provide them with a practice, and then they could just go on with their lives, whatever else they were doing, their families, whatever else, their lives. And so the real core of insight meditation in New Zealand is actually quite small. And wasn't doing very much. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the things which I discovered early was that none of the teachers here really kind of lit my fires. And that I found teachers overseas who really did light my fire. And among them, there was Martine and Stephen Batchelor. I thought Martine was wonderful, full of warmth and heartfulness. Stephen's kind of intellectual approach and his secular approach was something that I've been following over the years, and I really appreciated that. And as I say, brought Stephen to New Zealand and Martine and ran some retreats with them, offered retreats, which attracted up to about 50 people, which was a very large number for New Zealand. But nothing very much came out. All attempts of something coming out of that were kind of, it didn't happen. There was no real community came out of it. People went back to their local communities and did their thing, whatever it was they were doing, or they did nothing. So my next venture, if you like, my next attempt to create community was to set up something called Aotearoa Buddhist Education Trust, which I did with three spiritual friends. I'm in Wellington, so one was in Auckland, one was in Nelson, and the South Island, and one was down outside Christchurch, where the earthquake was. And the idea behind Aotearoa Buddhist Education Trust was that we would bring teachers, insight meditation teachers, to New Zealand, and we would ask people to make donations to the trust, which would be towards their travel costs, which is one of the major costs of bringing people because we're so far away from everywhere else. And thereby lowering the cost of retreats and enabling more people to go there. Now, a lot of people totally misunderstood what we were trying to do. They saw, so you're asking for money. Money and the Dharma do not go together. And I thought, shit, you really haven't understood this. What we were doing was threefold. We were first of all trying to publicize retreats from overseas teachers. So we were bringing teachers, for example, the Insight Dialogue group would publicize their teachers. I bring Stephen and Martine Batchelor over and publicize them. Other people would bring teachers across, and we'd try and publicize those. And what I realized was actually the teachers I was bringing weren't insight meditation teachers, but Stephen and Martin, who were not insight meditation, but something completely different. And so yes, okay. So we were doing two things. One was we were fundraising, but we didn't get much money, and it wasn't really for the money that we were doing it. We were trying to publicize the retreat. The other thing, which was very big for me, and this is very much a personal thing, was to increase the practice of generosity, because I felt that's something that anybody can do, and it's really a lovely practice. I mean, if you can do that, you're opening your heart up. So generosity, for me personally, as an only child, generosity isn't something that comes very easily. So I've had to train myself in it, and I just thought, well, that's what it's about, and that's what Aotearoa Buddhist Education Trust has been doing. I'm not sure if it's going to continue or how it's going to continue, but we'll see.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that story. I just wanted to note to people who are listening to the podcast, I did put a link out on Facebook for the Secular Buddhism New Zealand Facebook page on the Secular Buddhist Facebook page, and within 10 minutes, I had 5 people like it already. So I expect there's going to be some awareness raised based just on that, and I'm very hopeful that things will progress. And as always, so people do know that we do have a link not just on the episode page for this episode, but you can find links to Secular Buddhism New Zealand on the partners sites on Community on the SBA site. And you'll find out more about things when you go to that site. And it includes, by the way, videos. And so we'll have links to that YouTube channel as well. And you can see Ramsey because he gives one of the talks, and the initial YouTube, it's right there, and Ramsey's on talking. So it's good to see you on that one.
Now, one thing you mentioned earlier, which I kind of didn't answer very fully, but I think we could usefully get back to it, because I think the audience for this podcast need to consider this, is this notion of national boundaries. I mean, Secular Buddhism New Zealand, Secular Buddhism Australia, Secular Buddhism United Kingdom, wherever, in the days of the internet, how useful are these national boundaries, and what are they for? I think that's a discussion which we need to have. I mean, you have the Secular Buddhist Association, which, as you said, can appeal to anybody on this planet or any others.
Yes, I planned it specifically for our first engagement with the Vulcans when they run into us. So it's not even Earth; it's anybody.
So this was a discussion that I had with Kate yesterday, as we was talking about what we had hoped for a Facebook page for Secular Buddhism New Zealand, and we had to say that each of our sites are going to have a slightly different flavour. And I noticed, for example, that Lenore on Secular Buddhism Australia has something that she calls Sutta Central, which is discussion group around the suttas, which is very good and very useful. I'm very glad she's done it. And she's also putting up resources for the heart, I think it's called, and that's lovely. That's really good. In New Zealand, what I've done is to put up resources. I've tried to create, if you like, a little home for some of the writings of Winston Higgins, who's a wonderful writer, lovely man, and a great teacher. And I actually went to Sydney, and I met with Winton and with Lenore 2 or 3 Sundays ago. And we discussed that there are differences, and they're not sort of schism kind of different. It's just slight differences in approach, and they're complementary to each other. So it's good to see them, and I guess we will have these different approaches. The national boundaries are somewhat irrelevant, but at least from our point of view, we're 2 large islands. If we bring a teacher over here, then we can encourage people from our 2 large islands to come and sit with them. And that's going to be the value, I think, of having a Secular Buddhism New Zealand.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's nice to see this development. And the national boundaries make sense when we're talking about things like the propagation of physical groups that meet face to face. And I think online practice, although it is progressing, It doesn't have the same visceral appeal and impact as face-to-face practice, time with a teacher, with spiritual friends, however you want to approach it. Having those physical get-togethers, that's part of having an actual community. And our online communities and these different offerings that Lenore has put out and that you are putting out and that we see on the different sites in the UK and the different, even just the different ways in which we blog on the various sites, those are going to be available to everyone. And that's a great thing. That's celebrating the diversity and complementing, as you put it, one another. That's the wonderful thing about having so many ways to engage with a secular practice, is that broadens the appeal. So I see nothing but positives in those differences are a strength, not a weakness.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a friend in Bhutan as a work colleague, and she's interestingly enough, she loves the teaching of Thich Nhat Hanh, which I found fascinating, given that she's from Bhutan and there's such a strong teachings of their own there. So hopefully when I go there, we may see a secular Buddhism Bhutan sort of getting off the ground. But yes, it's the possibilities are wonderful and endless in a sense. Now, one thing I want to add, again, something that just occurred to me, is when developing community, one thing I did here several years ago was to get a series of talks downloaded off of dharmaseed.org. I organized a series of meetings on a Wednesday night in the center of town, which somebody played the talks. We listened to there was about 15 of us who came in the end. So there were 8 talks, those 8 nights, 8 weeks running. We listened to those talks and we discussed them. And on the 9th Wednesday night, we actually Skyped Stephen Batchelor in France. And we said, right, we've been listening to these talks. We've got some questions now. And that was wonderful. I know if we can't bring people to New Zealand, well, then Skype is the way, we did that. It was about 4 or 5 years ago now.
And that's one of the wonderful things about the internet, and this is a discussion that's occurring right now on the Buddhist Geeks site for their conference. They're having discussions so that people who are going to be attending the conference get to know each other. And Ken MacLeod and I are, as of this recording, having a discussion about some of the impacts of technology on our practice and the way we engage, and things like websites and Skype enabling us to speak to the teachers after we've gone through hearing them speak about a particular topic and being able to ask them directly these questions just opens up a world of possibilities for us. Again, we're no longer geographically constrained.
Yep. Agreed.
So, Ramsey, what do you see? Put on the turban, look at the crystal ball. What do you see as some of the new kinds of developments we might see in the next few years for your site and the things you're working on, and just with secular Buddhism in general? What's your sense of the direction that this is headed?
I can only really talk about what I'd like to see rather than what I think is going to happen. What I'd like to see may not happen, but what I'd like to see is people around the country meeting each other and face to face, building up some kind of in localities. I put 2 people in a little town called Whakatane in touch with each other. Now, I don't know whether they've met yet, but hopefully we can do that with Auckland and with Christchurch, with various people, and just develop community. I mean, one of the things that really, again, I think will develop us as a community globally will be to develop us locally as well. It's the whole thing of act locally, think globally. And I think that's the way it's going to work.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this isn't about just developing an online presence. It's using social networking and our technological tools as what they are, tools for us to help build and support one another in our practice.
Yeah, I mean, Lloyd Gearing, who's the, as I mentioned before, he's I call him the theoretician of this St Andrews on the Terrace, what they call him, the theologian. He claimed that the process of secularization should not be regarded as an anti-religious movement because it leaves the future of religion as an open question. And what I would really argue is that a secular meditation practice which stresses the practice of being in the present moment shows the irrelevance of religious beliefs. But religious practices such as the kiddushim, the kiddush, the wine that would happen after the Saturday morning service in the synagogue, that's where community is going to be created. So it's getting together, the potluck dinners, the discussions, that's where we've got to look to our future. And the podcast is helping that. It's going to help us do that, clearly, by giving us the reasons for getting together. I mean, a superstition, let's face it, is what's called any belief or practice that's outlived the cultural context in which it was once appropriate. So if we're going to put away our superstitions, which is what the podcast is helping us to do, then, we've got to find ourselves getting together as well.
I'm eager to see what the next few years bring, and I absolutely want to make a visit out of this country and into your beautiful country and visit our friends in the UK and in Germany and Australia along the way as well. Our guest today has been Ramsey Margolis. Again, you can find out more about what their work is on the Secular Buddhism New Zealand site, which is secularbuddhism.org.nz, or Z if you prefer. Ramsey, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you, Ted. I'm most flattered to be invited to speak with you like this.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.